In this video, we're going to continue creating an advanced inventory in Unity 2019. And this is basically like a mini series that we're running on this channel, and this is episode 2. And we're gonna have like 3 or 4 episodes, so if you guys enjoyed this one, definitely make sure to leave a like on this video. I also want to mention that this series is made possible thanks to all of our Patreons, including makeagame.com, Flu Joey, Richard Stans, Kupla, and James Dogan. Thanks to your support, I'm able to make this series of videos, and if you guys want to check out how you can support me make more content, definitely check out the Patreon link in the description below. So now with that being said, let us get started with episode 2, in which we're gonna focus on picking up and creating items. Okay, so we're back in Unity, and you'll remember this project from episode 1 where we basically designed the inventory itself, and it's looking pretty good in my opinion. It's not like a super high graphics looking inventory, but it's better than nothing. So what we're gonna do is we'll first and foremost go to scripts folder, which we created in the previous episode, and we're gonna create a new C# script in here, and this one is gonna be called item. Alright, so I just opened up the component in Visual Studio. So first things first, we're gonna start by creating a few variables that are going to be used for every single item we have across the game. And the first one I can think of is a public string, and this is gonna be called type. So this is going to define what type of item this is, if it's like a food item or if it's a weapon that the player should equip and stuff like that. And right above this one, I'm going to create a public int ID and maybe even a public string description. So we're going to use ID as an integer, which is a number, just to kind of identify which item this is. We will also add a public texture to the icon. And the icon will basically be displayed in the inventory when we actually pick up the item. So now I'm gonna go to the inventory script, and under void update, we're gonna say void on trigger enter collider. Oh, there we go. Visual Studio just goes, I know what you're gonna write, just let me do this for you. Okay, so inside of this, we're gonna say if other.tag equal to item, then we're gonna have a little function that's gonna run. So let us go ahead and create that function under on trigger enter, and we're gonna call this void add item. So I want to actually gain access to the variables that we have inside of our item script. So here, all of these variables, I want to get access to them, and the easiest way of doing so is by adding a few parameters. So if you don't know what a parameter is, it basically allows you to call the void itself, right? So add item. And then we can also define some values inside of the void itself. And that is when we actually call it. So for instance, here I can say int ID, or maybe even item ID, and then string item type, string description, or item description, and then finally texture to the item icon. And going back to the on trigger enter void, so inside of the if statement, we can basically say add item, and then define these variables that we just put in here. But to gain access to them, first and foremost, I'm just going to remove this line, and we're gonna say game object item picked up is gonna be equal to other.gameObject. And this is gonna allow us to create a new game object for temporarily just inside of this void, and that is going to be the other game object that we actually pick up. So in this case, the item itself. And we're also gonna say item, which is a reference to the item script, and we can call this just an item with a lowercase I. Make sure that it is lowercase though, because if you use the uppercase, it's going to refer to the item script once again. And this one is gonna be equal to item picked up dot get component item, which is the component itself, and just end it there. And we're referring to these because now when we're gonna call the void itself for adding item into the inventory, we're gonna say add item, and then inside of the parentheses, we're going to define these variables that we referred to earlier. So in here, we can, for instance, say item.id, comma, item.type, comma, once again, and then item.description, and one last comma, and this time we're gonna say item.icon. Oh, not item.description. Okay, Visual Studio, thank you. There we go, item.icon. So this basically allows us to easily refer to every single variable that we have inside of the item script when we're actually adding the item into our inventory. And if we didn't do this, it's fine, we could also do it inside of the void, but it becomes a little bit more restricted that way. So in order to add the item into our inventory, we're gonna need to read all of these slots that are available. However, luckily for us, in the previous episode, we actually did that by having a for loop up here, which is going to read all of the available slots at the start of the game. So what we can do in this void itself is basically recreate that for loop. So we can say for int I equal to 0. I is lower than all slots available, or all slots as it's called. And as long as it is, we're gonna say I++. So in this for loop, we're gonna check every single slot and see if they contain an item or if they're empty and ready to pick up our item. But to do that, we need to add a component to every single slot in our game. So let us switch back to Unity real quick, and I'm just going to extend the inventory inside of our canvas and see all of these slots that are available. So now I'm going to create one more script inside of our scripts folder, and once again, it's a C# script, and this one is going to be called slot. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight every single slot that we have in the hierarchy. If Unity stops lagging. Unity doesn't lag. What are you talking about? So we're just going to highlight every single one of these slots, add a new component to them, and this one is going to be a slot component. There we go. So let's go ahead and open up in Visual Studio. And in here, we're actually not going to do a lot of things right now, at least for the moment being. So we're just going to have a public bool, and we can call this empty. And after saving this script, we're basically going to go back to inventory. And now inside of here, the for loop, we're going to have a if statement and say if slot I in the brackets, basically this slot right now inside of this for loop, and we're going to get a component of it, which is the slot component that we just added. And we're gonna say, we're basically gonna check if this is empty, then we're gonna add item to slot. So how do we actually add this item into our inventory? Well, first and foremost, I'm going to go back to the item script itself, and in here we're gonna have a new public bool, and this one is gonna be called picked up. Oh, and also one thing I now forgot is we're actually gonna need to add one more parameter in here. So we're gonna say game object, item object, and then just a comma so that it keeps going up. And now you can see that we have an error for add item, which is because we're using 4 parameters instead of 5 when we call the function. So we're basically gonna say item picked up and then a comma. And we're doing this to obviously get access to the game object itself in this void right here. So now in here we can say item object dot get component item, and then say picked up equal to be true. And now we're also going to change a few things in the slot itself. So we're gonna say slot I dot get component slot, and try to access the icon itself for the slot here. So we need to go back to the slot script and just add a new public texture 2D, which is going to be called icon. So we'll go back to inventory script now and say icon equal to item icon. And what I think we can do is go to the item script and copy all of the, oh, not that button. So basically just copy all of these 3 variables at the top, go to the slot script and paste them in here. We're actually gonna need to access these anyways, so it's just easier for us to have them as a variable, each variable basically in the slot script too. So we can now go back to inventory, and I'm going to copy this part of the script, or rather the statement, because we are going to need to get component slot of the slot that is currently available. So we're gonna jump a line down, and I'm just gonna paste this and then type in whatever I need. So the type of the slot is also going to change to item type, and the same thing with ID is going to be item ID, and also the description is going to be the item description. And one final thing I want to do is go back to slot once again and create one more variable here and say public game object item. And this is going to be the item that is contained by this inventory slot. So we can go back to the inventory script, and at the top we can actually say, just paste it in one more time and say dot item equal to item object. There we go. So now we're letting the slot component, which is basically the slot component of the slot, access all of the variables from the item itself. And the inventory is almost working as a bridge between the slot component and the item component, feeding in data to the slot component. After all this happens, I'm also going to say item object dot transform.parent is equal to slot I.transform. And the reason I'm doing this is basically to move the transform, the game object itself, the item we're picking up, into the slot 2. And we can also say item object dot set active false, so that we just disable it for the moment being until the player actually equips or uses the item. And now, last but not least, we're also gonna jump a few lines down and say slot I get component slot dot empty equal to false. So one more thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna jump back up to the void start, and inside of the for loop in here, we're basically gonna add one more thing. So we're gonna have an if statement. Let me actually jump a line down. We're gonna have an if statement, and we're gonna paste the same thing we just copied. So if slot I.get component slot dot item equal to null, basically meaning that it's empty, then we're going to paste it in one more time and say empty equal to true. So this basically means when we start our game, right? When we start the game, it's going to check for each slot's component slot and see if it is actually empty. And if it is, then it's going to say, hey, it is empty, and we're going to set this boolean to be true. And the way we're checking it is by if the item game object variable in the slot component is actually null, so it's empty, there is no game object. And there is this free axe model that I found from the asset store, so I'm gonna go ahead and download this and import it into my project, which we're gonna use as a demo weapon to pick up for the player. Alright, so I just got the axe model, so I'm gonna drag it into our scene, and we're gonna add a rigid body component to it. Not rigid body 2D, just a rigid body. We're also gonna add the item component, and we will add a box collider. So let us modify the box collider a little bit. And now I'm going to copy this box collider and then simply right click on it once again and paste component as new. And this time around, this is going to be the same box collider, but we're gonna check is trigger and change the size to be a little bit larger than the other collider, so that this one actually overrides in terms of like the collision detection. So in the type field of the item script on this game object, we're gonna say weapon, and then the description can be a simple axe used as a weapon. And then for the icon, we're basically gonna go to our RPG inventory icons and drag and drop the axe icon in here. And we're not gonna touch picked up because that is going to be assigned by Unity automatically. And we're also gonna click on the tag, add tag, and we're gonna create a new tag called item. So we're gonna go back to the axe now. So now inside of our slot script, we're basically gonna create a new void and say public void update slot. And first and foremost, let's also go up here and say using Unity engine.ui, because we're going to be using the UI library for Unity. And I actually forgot something which I remember now. We will not use a texture 2D, instead we're just going to use a sprite, because that is what the image component of the UI system in Unity actually uses. It's not a texture 2D. So we're basically changing public texture 2D icon to public sprite icon, and we're going to do the same thing inside of our item components, so just write in sprite here. And also in the inventory script, we're going to change the parameters, so we can say sprite, and that is all we need to do basically. So now we can go back to slot and we can say this.getComponent image.sprite equal to icon. Oh, and also one more important thing is when we change the variable type of something, like from texture 2D to sprite, it basically sometimes unassigns it if the type doesn't really, basically if the type mismatches, it says type mismatch, right? So we basically, all we have to do is just drag in and drop the axe sprite once again. And so now we're gonna go back to inventory script, and above the empty equal to false statement, we're basically gonna paste in the slot I get component thing once again, and this time we're gonna say update slot. So we're basically calling the void from here. Now the thing is, if we play the game right now as it is, it's basically going to add the item into every single slot that it finds empty, because we're never really breaking out of the for loop, even though we have found something that is empty, we have added in the item. And we can solve this super easily by just simply jumping a line down after the if statement, however still in the for loop, right? So we just jump down the line here and say return. So now if we play the game and we walk over this axe and then press I, you can see that we have picked up the item. And the best thing is, if we go to this slot here, you can see that the item is in there and no longer on the map to be found. However, there's one thing. So when we pick up this axe, you can see that if we open up the inventory, the inventory slot itself is no longer visible because it doesn't look like this one, right? And the easiest way for me to fix this is actually by highlighting every single slot in here, right-clicking on them, going to UI, and picking panel. So this is basically going to add a panel to every single slot. And it's also going to be the same size of the initial slot itself. And now we're going to go back to the slot script, and up here in the variable section, we're going to call a new public game object. And this one is going to be called slot icon GO, which basically stands for game object. And now we're going to create a void start, and we're going to say slot icon GO is going to be equal to transform.getChild in parentheses 0. Oh, and obviously from public game object we can change this to transform. So now instead of having this game object's image changing, we're gonna say slot icon GO. Alright, so going back to Unity and playing the game, you can now see that if we pick up the axe, it now happens to be here with a normal slot. And I actually like this empty slots having the white background kind of setup. I think it's pretty good. Now underneath public void update slot, we're gonna have a new public void, and this one is going to be called use item. And inside of our item script now, we're going to also create a public void and call this item usage. And in here, we're going to create all different types of items. So for instance, we can have a weapon here, we can have a health item here, and even some kind of beverage. For now, we're going to focus on the weapon. So we're going to say if type equal to weapon, then we're going to allow everything for a weapon inside of this if statement. And we can also create a new public bool, and this one is going to be called equipped. And inside of the weapon statement, we can say equipped equal to true. And now let us go ahead and create a public void update and say if equipped, then we're going to perform weapon acts here. So this is where we actually are going to allow the player to attack with the weapon, whereas here we're basically just going to equip the weapon and place it in front of the player. So now going back to Unity, we're going to create an empty game object on our player, and this one we're going to call weapon manager. So what this allows us to do is we can now add in a new axe in here and basically place it and just kind of position it in front of the player as we want it to be held by the player. So we can also call this axe player, and we're also going to add the item script onto this. And now let us make it a child of the weapon manager. And now we're going to go to our axe game object that we can pick up and make sure that ID is set to be 1. And we're going to do the same thing with the axe player, because ID is going to be the field that we compare when we press on the item inside of the inventory in order to enable the game object from the weapon manager. So we can go back to Visual Studio, and in here we're going to create a new boolean and call this player's object. So this basically is going to be checked manually by us on every game object that it is actually in the player's weapon manager. And come to think of it, we can actually jump a few lines down and say hide in inspector for equipped. So we're gonna hide this field from the inspector so that we don't confuse this one with this one. And we will also create a new public game object, and this one is going to be called weapon. And this is going to be the game object inside of the player's weapon manager. And we could actually do the same thing by simply copying this and pasting it on this, and just simply cutting this and pasting it up here. And we can actually do the same thing with this by simply cutting this and jumping a few lines down here and pasting it there. And actually, public bool player's object can be called player's weapon. And so now inside public void start, we're gonna say if it's not player's weapon, then we're gonna scan for the weapon inside of the player's weapon manager. So let me actually copy and paste this hide in inspector game object, but this one call it weapon manager. And inside of void start, but above the if statement, we're gonna say weapon manager equal to game object dot find with not that way find with tag weapon manager with no spaces. And let's actually go to Unity and check the weapon manager in the hierarchy. Click on tag, and add a weapon manager tag with no spaces. Now go back to weapon manager and pick the weapon manager tag. And now inside of this if statement, we're gonna say int all weapons equal to weapon manager dot transform child count. And then we will have a for loop in here and say int I equal to 0, I lower than all weapons, I plus plus. And we're basically going to check for the ID here. So we will say if transform.getChild in parentheses I dot game object get component item, and check for the ID in here is equal to ID, so basically the ID of this game object, then we're gonna have something happen. In that case, we're gonna say weapon, which is the game object, is going to be equal to transform.getChild in parentheses I dot game object. So basically all we're saying is we're gonna check for all weapons inside of the weapon manager. So all of the game objects inside weapon manager, we're gonna check them, and we do that by using the for loop. And then we're saying by basically checking every single transform in there, we're saying if one of them has the ID in the item component, which is the same as the ID for this game object, which is the object that we're picking up, then we're going to set the weapon variable that we referred here to be equal to that game object that is the same ID. So we're basically checking if two game objects are sharing the same ID. And so if that happens, in item usage void, we're basically going to jump a line down above equipped, and we're going to say weapon.setActive true. So going back to Unity, we can now disable the axe player game object. Now, once again, going back to the slot script, we're gonna also say using Unity engine.event system or systems. And mono behavior, we're also gonna extend that by saying iPointer handler, or actually, let's say iPointer click handler, not up handler. And then we're gonna have a public void on pointer click pointer event data, and basically say the same pointer event data but with a lowercase p. There we go. So basically this is going to check whenever we click on this. So when we click, we're gonna want to use item, which is the void that we have here. However, it is empty right now. So all we gotta say here is item.getComponent, item usage. And going back to Unity, we're gonna go to the axe player, which we disabled, and make sure to check player's weapon. Oh, also, I made a stupid mistake, my bad. So if transform get child in the item script should be if weapon manager dot transform, because we're trying to access all of the children game object for the weapon manager, not this item itself. And we also need to do the same thing here. So just weapon manager dot transform dot get child. Cool. So if we now play the game, let us play the game, go on Unity, and we're now going to pick up the axe, and then basically just enable the inventory, press on this, and we can see that the axe is now enabled. So we basically equip the axe, which is perfect. So just a quick overview, I guess you could say, of how the system works. Basically, inside of the void update, where we basically check if the item is equipped, this is going to allow you to perform weapon things here. And inside of item usage, it's basically what we call from the slot script when you click on the item in the inventory. And this basically just sets it active, which is going to be true, so that it's visible, and also sets the equipped boolean to be true as well, which obviously triggers this if statement in the update void. And inside of if equipped, you can also do if input.getKeyDown keycode.g, for instance, just an example, and then set it equipped equal to false. And then say if equipped equal to false, then weapon set active will also be false. Oh, I made a mistake. You have to have two equal marks there. Oh, and also actually, instead of saying weapon.setActive, we can say this.setActive, or rather this.gameObject.setActive, because here we're basically controlling the weapon that player actually equips. And because of that, we may also need to change equipped to weapon.getComponent item. That one is going to be equipped equal to true. So now if we go back to Unity and play the game one more time, pick up the axe, enable it, and now if we press G on our keyboard, it gets disabled. And we can enable it once again and disable, once again and disable. Cool. So basically what we have done is now all of our items are being detected by our inventory, and whenever we pick up an item from the scene itself, it automatically links itself to the axe or the weapon or the item that is inside of our weapon manager by simply checking the IDs and comparing the ID of itself for the one that we're picking up compared to the one inside of our weapon manager. Alright, so that is all for this episode. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys enjoyed episode 2 of this new series. This is once again just a mini series, and if you guys like these videos, make sure to give this video a thumbs up to show some support, and also hit the subscribe button to stay up to tune for new content. Also, let us know in the comments if you guys are actually enjoying this inventory system, and if you have any feedback or even like ideas in regards to what we can cover in the future episodes before ending the series. series, since this is a mini series after all, just let me know in the comments because I'm always looking forward to some feedback and all that kind of stuff. Don't forget that both our Discord server and our Patreon page are both linked in the description box of this video and also in the pinned comment, so make sure to check it out there if you guys want to actually support this series further. So yeah, with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'm looking forward to see you in our comment section and in the Discord server tonight. So until next time, thanks for watching and peace out.